Every film is a reflection of the era it was made in, so it's impossible to remake a movie that has the same impact the original had when it was released. In 1984, Freddy was an original idea, and a sadistic, playful monster that lives in your dreams was something that people had never seen before. Freddy was just like the marketing for the Blair Witch Project, the shower scene from Psycho, or even the Orson Welles radio broadcast. He was iconic for his time, but not something you can repackage decades later and have the same relevance or impact. One of the reasons the Elm Street remake was so bad is because it never stopped to ask if the original was successful because of when it came out, and not because of the idea itself. The Exorcist was so terrifying because religion was a much bigger part of people's lives in 1973, and because the belief in God is much lower today than it was 50 years ago, a remake of The Exorcist could never have the same impact in 2022. Robocop was about more than just a cyborg police officer. Behind the dark humor and the over-the-top violence, there were themes of corporate overreach, a society desensitized to violence, and the dystopian future it was set in mirrored many of the problems 1987 urban cities were dealing with. A movie like Robocop can only work in the 80s, because without the freedom to use hyper-violent satire, a modern remake ends up being the equivalent of a PG-13 porno. It was a movie made during a time where everything didn't have to be politically correct and it could just tell the story it wanted to tell. But the remake was just a generic sci-fi action movie that tried to incorporate much of the modern woke bullshit that makes so many movies today unwatchable.
Why is America so robophobic?
There's not many movies that I would want to see a remake of, but I think a Nightmare on Elm Street remake could actually be better than the originals if it changed a few fundamental aspects of the story. I said in the beginning that movies are often successful because of when they come out and not necessarily because of the idea. 4 middle-aged men starting a ghost hunting business isn't a great idea on paper, but Ghostbusters was so great because of the cast and the chemistry. If it had the exact same cast, it could have been about 4 guys starting almost any type of business, because it wasn't so much about the story, it was just a vehicle for the actors to deliver their brand of comedy. The ghost hunting part was the least important aspect of it, and that's why the remake failed so badly, because the director didn't understand why we liked the original. So what would a good Elm Street remake look like? Any Elm Street remake should focus on the dream world more than Freddy himself, and it should explore the psychological side of nightmares and how isolated they can feel. The story should play with reality, so we're never really sure when we're in a dream, and it should feel more like Inception or Jacob's Ladder. Inception starts off in a dream, and we never have a chance to get grounded in what reality actually is. We think most of the movie takes place in the real world and only the action scenes take place in the unconscious mind, but maybe Cobb's wife was right, and the entire movie is a dream within a dream, and we never see a single frame of the real world. It's always really obvious when someone's dreaming in the Elm Street movies, and there's only a few times where the movies tried to make the dreams feel normal so the characters didn't actually know when they were asleep. The first movie flirted with this idea at the end, but the sequels never seemed to put much focus on it. Nancy beat Freddy because she pulled him into the real world, but everything about the final scene says otherwise. After we saw the striped sweater drop top and Freddy pull her dead mom through the tiny door window, the only logical answer was that Nancy had been dreaming for some portion of the movie and we didn't even realize it. Freddy was still alive, so it's possible that Nancy never actually woke up when she beat him, so if the sequels would have played with the idea of everything possibly taking place in a dream world, it would have made us question the reality of everything we saw in the sequels. A good remake would also have to drop the revenge motivation so anyone can dream about Freddy, and not just teenagers or people living in a specific place. Jason doesn't give a shit who you are. If you come to Crystal Lake, he'll kill you. Pinhead doesn't care why you did it. If you open the box, he'll kill you. And it's the same for every other slasher. They'll kill whoever steals their gold or says their name in the mirror or watches the VHS tape. This was something that ruined the potential of the Sinister movies. If the box of movies could just show up in anyone's house, it would have made the idea more terrifying instead of only being in the house that the last family was killed in. Freddy should be able to show up in anyone's dream, and the terrifying part would be that he can trap you in the dream world and you would never be able to wake up. The final thing a remake would have to do is actually make Freddy scary on a visceral level. Out of all the modern monsters and slashers, Freddy might be the most iconic, but he's also one of the least scary. And I'm not just saying that because I'm old enough to know that movie monsters aren't real. I'm talking about the idea of Freddy, and comparing him to others like Jason, Leatherface, or Pinhead. Freddy is the only one that never pushed the limits of the idea, and we never got to see how scary a dream demon can actually be. Only 3 of the films tried to make him scary, and every other time he was basically just Deadpool with a hat. And I know his sense of humor is the thing that makes him so great, but he could have been truly terrifying if he was more mysterious and didn't talk so much. With all that said, I started to look for movies that were similar to Nightmare on Elm Street, and I was surprised that I couldn't find that many that had dream monsters or that played with reality from a horror perspective. There was only one that seemed to check all of the boxes, and surprisingly, it was exactly what I think an Elm Street remake would look like. Come True is an amazing experience, both from a sensory perspective and on an intellectual level. It's a slow burn that forces you to think, but because of the lack of jump scares and a monster that's intentionally ambiguous, I don't think most people will enjoy it as much as they should. The basic story is about a teenage girl that joins a sleep study, and the shadow man in her dreams starts to take over her reality. There's also a deeper exploration of the mind through Carl Jung's theory of collective unconscious, but I'll save that until later because I want to focus on the Elm Street aspects first. Come True is atmospheric and moody, complex and artistic. It's visually stunning with an amazing soundtrack, and it's also so narratively ambiguous that you're never sure what's happening until the very last scene, where everything makes perfect sense and no sense at the same time. Along with the symmetrically focused cinematography, the music transitions from a haunting ambient score to 80s synth pop, and it makes it feel like a mix of Donnie Darko and Drive. Come True starts with a really interesting interpretation of what dreams look like. Movies usually make dreams look too much like real life, but if we were able to actually record our dreams and watch them, they would probably be more abstract and not as focused as we remember them when we woke up. For some unknown reason, Sarah would rather sleep in a park than go home and talk to her mom. She struggles to stay awake throughout the day, and because she's desperate to find somewhere to sleep, she accepts a position in a paid sleep study. Now, we don't learn this until later, but the purpose of the study is to record her dreams so they can be watched like a movie, so they can study a shadow man that Sarah's been coincidentally dreaming about long before she even joined the study. Now, I have to spoil the twist so I can explain why I think this is a perfect remake to the Elm Street franchise, but I think this is one of the few times when knowing the twist makes the movie better because there's so many little details you can enjoy more if you know what's going on. In the final scene, after her reality is fully unraveled, she gets a text telling her that she's been in a coma for 20 years and the doctors have been trying to figure out a way to wake her up. After you learn about the twist, it's pretty obvious to see that she was dreaming the second time you watch it, but the interesting part is trying to figure out when it actually happens. Now, I personally think the entire movie is a dream because there's so many details in the first 10 minutes that give it away. The first 10 minutes have almost no dialogue, and every scene with Sarah is always framed with her at the center of an empty space. The equipment, clothes, and design of everything all suggest that this takes place in the 80s or 90s, but the iPhone and laptop make the time period even more ambiguous. The filmmaker does a great job in not showing us any street signs, landmarks, or details that give away the location or time period. And I think this is done on purpose as a way to tell us that this is all happening inside of Sarah's unconscious mind. Now, most people will probably think that everything before she joined the sleep study was normal, but it's a pretty big leap to believe that she's been dreaming about a shadow man and she's desperate to find a place to sleep, and there just so happens to be a sleep study that's doing research on the very man that she's been dreaming about. In the first Elm Street movie, Nancy's mom takes her to a sleep doctor so they can figure out why she's having trouble sleeping. And this is what I think the foundation of a remake should focus on. Just think if the stories from part 1 and 3 were combined, and all the kids in the hospital were there because they were part of a study on insomnia, and the doctors were secretly doing research on Freddy trying to get proof that he was real. One of the biggest problems with the Elm Street movies is they never capture how lonely and isolated you feel in a dream. The teens are usually alone when Freddy kills them, but multiple teens are dealing with them at the same time, so they can all lean on each other and figure out how to deal with them. Come True solves this problem by centering the story around Sarah, so the entire thing feels like it's a situation that's only happening to her. There's also the 2:39:1 aspect ratio and wide-frame symmetrical cinematography that's similar to It Follows and The Shining. This adds to the feeling of isolation, and it works really well with ambiguous monsters and makes the surrounding environment feel uneasy and alive. The use of a hazy blue filter and only close-ups and wide shots also makes the story feel intimate and distant at the same time. Now, I understand that the original Elm Street was meant to have a more fun, popcorn tone and not so much of a deep exploration into dreams and consciousness, but this is the approach I think a modern remake would have to take if it wanted to be successful. Freddy needs to be more like Bagul than Pennywise and use his powers to create terrifying scenarios instead of antagonizing everyone with silly one-liners. I like that the villain is an ambiguous shadow man that lives in a morbid dreamland. He doesn't have a clear objective or a backstory, and he's just as mysterious as nightmares themselves. It's debatable when Sarah falls into a coma, but we can tell about halfway through that reality is starting to crumble around her. The shadow man starts to show up outside of her dreams and other people start to see him, and then she starts to go through physical changes like her eyes changing color or growing vampire fangs. The climax of this film is probably the most unique ending I've ever seen in a horror movie. Sarah sleepwalks her way out of a hospital, down dark empty streets void of cars and people, then she makes her way out of the city, through the woods, and into an open field where she finds a cell phone that she lost after she had a seizure. This causes her to wake up and she has no idea where she is. There's not many intentionally scary scenes in this movie, but the final chase is one of the scariest scenes I've seen in a long time. Sarah starts to panic when she sees glowing eyes looking at her in the forest, and when she tries to run, Jeremy and the other female researcher get pulled into the surrounding void by an unseen force. It's not until she reaches the end of that road that we see the Shadow Man is responsible, and she wakes up from her dream within a dream to find that she's killed Jeremy while having sex with him. A deep psychological analysis of dreams and consciousness will make a much more compelling Freddy that could take advantage of the uncharted landscape of the mind. I know it's a dramatic change from the Freddy we all know and love, but I think such a drastic makeover is necessary if a remake wants to be successful.